There's a story they don't want you to hear in Sunday school. A story buried beneath centuries of theological spin and institutional cover-ups. A story about one of the most sacred beliefs in Christianity, the virgin birth, and how it was stolen, piece by piece, from the ancient world's most powerful goddess cults. You've been told that the miraculous conception of Jesus Christ was a unique, divine event, that Mary's virginal pregnancy was unprecedented in human history, that this was God breaking into the world in a way never before witnessed. But what if I told you that's a lie? What if the virgin birth wasn't original at all, but rather a calculated plagiarism of mythological templates that had been circulating for centuries before Jesus was ever born? Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of Christianity's most foundational doctrines and expose the uncomfortable truth that the Church has spent 2,000 years trying to hide. Because when you start digging into the historical record, when you examine the archaeological evidence, when you trace the iconographic connections across cultures and centuries, a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. The virgin birth wasn't a miracle, it was a marketing strategy. To understand how this deception unfolded, we need to travel back to the ancient Mediterranean world, where gods and mortals mingled in ways that would make modern theologians squirm. This wasn't a world where divine intervention was rare or shocking. This was a world where virgin births, miraculous conceptions, and divine parentage were the standard operating procedure for any deity worth worshipping. Walk through the pantheons of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Persia, and you'll find the same story repeated over and over again with minor variations. A mortal woman, usually young and pure, is visited by a god. Through supernatural means, she conceives a child who will grow up to be a savior, a hero, or a divine king. The child possesses extraordinary powers, performs miracles, and often dies and resurrects to save humanity. This wasn't coincidence. This was formula. Take Mithras, the Persian god whose cult dominated Roman military camps for centuries. Born from a virgin on December 25th, he was called the Light of the World and the Good Shepherd. His followers celebrated his birth with gift-giving and feasting, and they believed his sacrifice would grant them eternal life. Or consider Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy. His mother Semele was a mortal virgin who conceived him through divine intervention. Dionysus was said to have turned water into wine, multiplied food to feed the hungry, and promised his followers resurrection after death. Then there's Heracles, whose mother Alcmene was visited by Zeus while her husband was away at war. The god took the form of her husband, and through this divine deception, she conceived the greatest hero of Greek mythology. These weren't isolated stories. They were part of a vast mythological ecosystem that stretched across the ancient world. Every culture had its version of the divine child born to a virgin mother. Every pantheon included gods who entered the world through miraculous conception. But here's what makes this pattern so significant for our story. These weren't just religious myths, they were cultural expectations. When ancient peoples encountered a new deity or a new religious movement, they looked for these familiar markers of divinity. A god without a miraculous birth story wasn't really a god at all. Now, imagine you're a first-century evangelist trying to spread the message of Jesus Christ throughout the Roman Empire. You're not preaching to Jews who understand messianic prophecies and Davidic lineages. You're preaching to Greeks and Romans and Egyptians who worship gods with names like Apollo and Jupiter and Isis. These people have very specific ideas about what makes someone divine. Your message is this: a Jewish carpenter's son from an obscure province was actually the Son of God, and he died on a cross to save humanity. The problem? In the Roman world, crucifixion was the death reserved for slaves and criminals. It was the most shameful, degrading execution imaginable. And you're asking sophisticated pagans to worship someone who died this humiliating death. But it gets worse. Early Christian preaching focused on Jesus' teachings, his death, and his resurrection. The earliest Gospel, Mark, doesn't even include a birth narrative. It starts with Jesus as an adult, being baptized by John. There's no mention of virgin birth, no angelic announcements, no miraculous conception. This created a massive problem for Christian evangelists. How do you convince people that someone with such humble origins and such a shameful death was actually divine? How do you compete with gods who have proper miraculous birth stories and heroic legends? The answer was simple. You give Jesus the birth story he needed to compete. This is where the theological sleight of hand begins. The later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, suddenly include elaborate birth narratives that weren't present in earlier Christian writings. These stories follow the familiar pagan pattern: divine announcement, virgin mother, miraculous conception, and supernatural birth circumstances. But the Gospel writers needed biblical cover for this mythological addition. They found it in a mistranslation that would change the course of history. Matthew's Gospel claims that Jesus' virgin birth fulfilled an ancient prophecy from Isaiah. "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." This seems like solid scriptural foundation until you examine the original Hebrew text. The word Isaiah actually used was alma, which simply means young woman or maiden. It doesn't specify virginity at all. The virgin translation comes from the Greek Septuagint, where alma was rendered as parthenos. This Greek word could mean either virgin or simply young unmarried woman. But Christian translators consistently chose the virginity interpretation to support their mythological adaptation. This wasn't an innocent translation error. This was a deliberate theological decision to create biblical justification for importing pagan birth narratives into Christian doctrine. But even with this prophetic cover story, the virgin birth doctrine wouldn't have survived if it hadn't tapped into something much deeper and more powerful than Jewish messianic expectations. It had to connect with the spiritual needs and religious instincts of the millions of pagans who were converting to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. And this is where the story takes its most fascinating turn, because the early Christians didn't just borrow from any random pagan mythology. They targeted the most popular, most emotionally resonant, and most visually established religious cult in their world: the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis and her divine son Horus. The cult of Isis wasn't some obscure Egyptian tradition confined to the Nile River Valley. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Isis worship had spread throughout every corner of the Roman Empire. From Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria, temples to Isis dominated urban landscapes. Roman soldiers carried Isis amulets into battle. Roman women prayed to Isis for protection in childbirth. Roman merchants invoked Isis for success in their ventures. Isis was the ultimate mother goddess, and her story reads like a rough draft of Christian doctrine. Her husband Osiris was murdered and dismembered by the forces of evil. Isis gathered his scattered remains and used her divine power to resurrect him long enough for her to conceive their son Horus. This miraculous conception occurred without traditional sexual intercourse, making Isis functionally a virgin mother. Horus grew up to become the divine savior who would defeat the powers of darkness and restore cosmic order. He was called the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the Son of God. His symbols included the cross and the fish. His followers believed that through identification with Horus, they could achieve eternal life after death. Sound familiar? But here's the smoking gun that proves direct plagiarism: the iconography. For centuries before Christianity emerged, Egyptian artists had been creating images of Isis nursing the infant Horus. These depictions, known as Isis Lactans, show the goddess seated on a throne, holding her divine child to her breast, gazing down at him with maternal love and divine authority. When Christian artists began depicting the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus, they didn't invent new visual conventions. They copied the Isis and Horus imagery exactly. The pose, the expression, the relationship between mother and child, even the throne-like seating arrangement. It was all borrowed wholesale from Egyptian religious art. The famous Madonna and child paintings that fill Christian churches and museums around the world aren't original Christian creations. They're Christian adaptations of Isis Lactans imagery that had been established for over a millennium. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate appropriation of religious symbolism that already carried deep emotional and spiritual resonance for millions of potential converts. The early church wasn't just stealing stories. They were stealing the most successful religious marketing campaign in human history, and they executed this theft with surgical precision. Consider the geographical footprint of early Christianity. The Apostle Paul wasn't wandering through Jewish villages debating Talmudic interpretations. He was traveling the major trade routes of the Roman Empire, preaching in cosmopolitan cities like Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome itself. These weren't backwater settlements. These were thriving metropolitan centers where dozens of religious cults competed for followers, where mystery religions promised salvation, and where the goddess Isis reigned supreme. In these cities, Isis temples weren't quaint ethnic curiosities tucked away in Egyptian quarters. They were massive, imposing structures that dominated city centers. They were staffed by professional priests who conducted elaborate rituals, maintained extensive libraries, and offered sophisticated theological teachings. The cult of Isis wasn't primitive superstition. It was organized religion at its most refined and successful. And here's what made Isis so irresistible to ancient worshippers. She wasn't a distant, unapproachable deity. She was a mother who had suffered loss, who had fought to protect her child, who understood human pain. Her mythology wasn't abstract philosophical speculation. It was deeply personal, emotionally resonant storytelling that spoke to universal human experiences of grief, hope, and redemption. When early Christian missionaries arrived in these Isis-dominated cities, they faced a choice. They could compete directly with this established religious powerhouse using their original Jewish messianic message, or they could adapt their story to tap into the existing spiritual infrastructure that Isis worship had already established. The choice was obvious, and the adaptation was systematic. First came the visual transformation. Christian artists didn't develop their own aesthetic vocabulary for depicting divine motherhood. They simply copied what already worked. The artistic conventions that had made Isis Lactans imagery so powerful. The serene maternal expression, the intimate nursing pose, the suggestion of both human tenderness and divine authority were transferred wholesale to Christian depictions of Mary and Jesus. But the theft went deeper than iconography. The emotional architecture of Isis worship was imported directly into Christian doctrine. Isis wasn't just Horus's mother. She was his protector, his advocate, his intercessor with the divine realm. When Horus's followers needed divine assistance, they didn't pray directly to him. They approached Isis, knowing that a mother's love would move her to intercede on their behalf. This intercessory role became central to Christian Marian doctrine. Mary wasn't just Jesus' mother. She became the mediator between humanity and divinity. Catholics didn't pray directly to Christ. They prayed to Mary, asking her to carry their petitions to her Son. The theological framework that made this system emotionally satisfying to believers had been perfected over centuries of Isis worship. The Church even adopted Isis's titles and epithets. Isis had been called Queen of Heaven, Star of the Sea, Mother of God, and Our Lady of Sorrows. These exact titles were transferred to Mary, creating instant recognition and emotional connection for former Isis worshippers who were converting to Christianity. But perhaps the most audacious theft was the appropriation of Isis's miraculous conception story itself. The Egyptian myth didn't present Isis as a passive vessel for divine intervention. She was an active agent who used her own magical powers to conceive Horus. She wasn't a teenager overwhelmed by divine visitation. She was a goddess who chose to become a mother in service of cosmic salvation. Early Christian theologians had to carefully edit this narrative to fit their patriarchal theological framework. They stripped Mary of Isis's agency and power, transforming her from an active goddess into a submissive human vessel. But they kept the essential miraculous conception element because it was the key that unlocked pagan acceptance of Jesus' divinity. This editing process reveals the calculated nature of the appropriation. The Church didn't accidentally stumble into Isis imagery. They deliberately selected which elements to preserve and which to modify based on their theological needs and their assessment of what would resonate with potential converts. The proof of this systematic appropriation can be traced through archaeological evidence across the Roman Empire. In city after city, researchers have documented the same pattern. Isis temples that were abandoned in the 3rd and 4th centuries, followed immediately by the construction of Christian churches dedicated to the Virgin Mary in the exact same locations. In some cases, the churches were literally built on top of the Isis temple foundations. The sacred geography wasn't relocated, it was rebranded. Former Isis worshippers could continue visiting the same holy sites, following the same pilgrimage routes, and engaging in similar ritual practices. The only difference was the name of the goddess they were honoring. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategic religious colonization. The most famous example is the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, built directly on top of an ancient temple to Isis. The church's name translates to Saint Mary over Minerva, but the Minerva temple had itself been converted to Isis worship centuries earlier. Layer by layer, goddess by goddess, the same sacred site served the same fundamental spiritual function, a place where believers could commune with divine feminine power. Similar patterns appear throughout the former Roman Empire. In Paris, the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés occupies an ancient Isis temple site. In London, the area around St. Paul's Cathedral was once dominated by Isis worship. In Alexandria, the Great Serapeum, one of the most magnificent Isis temples in the ancient world, was demolished in 391 CE, and its materials were used to construct Christian churches dedicated to Mary. The geographical evidence alone demolishes any claim that Christian Marian devotion developed independently from pagan goddess worship. The early church wasn't just borrowing mythological themes. They were conducting a systematic replacement campaign, site by site, city by city, goddess by goddess. But the most damning evidence of deliberate appropriation lies in the theological timeline itself. The virgin birth doctrine didn't emerge gradually through centuries of Christian reflection and spiritual development. It appeared suddenly, fully formed in the later Gospels, precisely when Christianity was expanding into the Isis-dominated territories of the Roman Empire. Mark's Gospel, written around 70 CE for a primarily Jewish audience, includes no birth narrative at all. It presents Jesus as an adult figure whose divine authority is demonstrated through his teachings and miracles, not through miraculous origins. Matthew and Luke, written between 80 and 90 CE for mixed Jewish and Gentile audiences, suddenly include elaborate birth stories that follow pagan mythological patterns. These narratives weren't developed through theological evolution. They were inserted to meet market demand. The early church fathers were remarkably candid about this adaptation strategy. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, explicitly acknowledged that Christian doctrines resembled pagan beliefs. His defense wasn't denial, it was theological jujitsu. He argued that demons had inspired pagan religions to create false versions of Christian truths before Christ's arrival, essentially claiming that the pagans had stolen from Christianity retroactively. This defense is revealing because it acknowledges the undeniable similarities while attempting to reverse the chronological relationship. Justin Martyr knew that informed pagans would immediately recognize the mythological parallels. His apologetic strategy was to claim prophetic fulfillment rather than cultural borrowing. Tertullian, another early church father, took a different approach. He argued that pagan parallels to Christian doctrine were evidence of universal spiritual truths that prepared humanity for Christ's revelation. This preparation evangelica theory suggested that God had planted seeds of Christian truth in pagan religions to make the transition to Christianity easier. Both explanations reveal the same underlying reality. Early Christian theologians were fully aware that their doctrines resembled existing pagan beliefs, and they developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks to explain these resemblances without admitting direct appropriation. But the historical record speaks louder than theological explanations. The virgin birth wasn't a unique divine revelation. It was a successful adaptation of proven mythological material. The early church didn't receive a new spiritual truth. They repackaged an existing one. And this repackaging worked brilliantly. Within 3 centuries, Christianity had transformed from a small Jewish sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire. Millions of former pagans had converted, bringing their spiritual expectations and devotional practices with them. The virgin birth doctrine served as the perfect bridge between pagan and Christian worldviews. Former Isis worshippers could continue their devotion to divine motherhood under Christian auspices. Former mystery religion initiates could still experience salvation through identification with a dying and rising God. Former participants in hero cults could still venerate a figure with miraculous origins and supernatural powers. The Church had successfully created a syncretic religion that felt familiar to pagans while maintaining enough Jewish elements to claim continuity with biblical tradition. It was a masterpiece of religious marketing that ensured Christianity's survival and dominance in the competitive spiritual marketplace of the late Roman Empire. But this success came at a cost that the Church has spent 2 millennia trying to conceal. The virgin birth wasn't a miracle, it was a merger. And understanding this merger reveals not divine intervention in human history, but human manipulation of divine narrative. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond historical curiosity. If the virgin birth was borrowed from pagan mythology, what does that say about the fundamental truthfulness of Christian doctrine? If the Church was willing to appropriate foreign religious elements to ensure its success, what other supposedly divine revelations might actually be calculated theological adaptations? These questions strike at the heart of Christian claims to unique revelation and exclusive truth. They suggest that Christianity wasn't born from divine intervention, but from human innovation, not from supernatural revelation, but from natural religious evolution. And the evidence supporting this conclusion isn't hidden in obscure academic journals or suppressed by ecclesiastical authorities. It's carved in stone, painted on walls, and buried in the archaeological record of every major city in the former Roman Empire. The theft of the virgin birth is written into the very architecture of Christian civilization. The theft wasn't limited to individual stories or isolated imagery. The early church conducted what can only be described as a systematic religious colonization campaign, methodically identifying and appropriating the most successful elements of competing spiritual traditions. And nowhere is this more evident than in the wholesale capture of the mother goddess archetype itself. Walk into any Catholic church today, and you'll witness the culmination of this ancient appropriation. The faithful don't just pray to Jesus, they direct their most intimate petitions to Mary. They light candles before her statue. They recite rosaries in her honor. They celebrate feast days marking her assumption into heaven. They invoke her as their advocate, their protector, their spiritual mother. This isn't peripheral devotion. This is the emotional and spiritual center of Catholic religious life. And it reveals the true scope of what the early church accomplished when they stole the virgin birth narrative from Egyptian mythology. They weren't just borrowing a story. They were hijacking an entire psychological and spiritual framework that had sustained human religious experience for millennia. The mother goddess wasn't some minor figure in ancient pantheons. She was the primary deity for millions of people across the Mediterranean world. Isis in Egypt, Cybele in Asia Minor, Diana in Ephesus, Demeter in Greece. These weren't competing goddesses serving different functions. They were regional variations of the same fundamental spiritual archetype, the divine feminine figure who creates, nurtures, protects, and intercedes on behalf of her children. This archetype tapped into something deeper than theological doctrine or philosophical speculation. It connected with the most primal human experience, the relationship between mother and child. Every person who ever lived entered the world through a woman's body. Every child's first experience of love, protection, and sustenance came from a maternal figure. The mother goddess cult wasn't artificial religious construction. It was the institutionalization of humanity's most fundamental emotional and biological reality. And the early church recognized that attempting to eliminate this deep-seated spiritual need would be not just difficult, but catastrophic for their conversion efforts. You cannot ask millions of people to abandon the religious framework that had sustained their ancestors for thousands of years without offering a compelling substitute. So they didn't eliminate the mother goddess. They rebranded her. The transformation was executed with breathtaking audacity. Mary, who appears in the earliest Christian writings as a minor figure, mentioned briefly in the Gospels and then largely ignored, was systematically elevated to goddess status under Christian theological cover. First came the title inflation. Mary became Theotokos, the God-bearer or Mother of God. This wasn't just honorific language, it was a theological nuclear weapon that placed Mary at the center of the Trinity itself. If Jesus was fully divine and Mary was his mother, then Mary was literally the mother of God. This gave her a cosmic status that rivaled or exceeded any pagan goddess. Then came the miraculous biography expansion. The early Gospels mention Mary's virginal conception of Jesus, but they say nothing about her own birth, her childhood, or her later life. Later, church traditions filled these gaps with increasingly elaborate mythological material. Mary's own conception became immaculate, free from original sin. Her birth was announced by angels. Her childhood was spent in the temple, fed by heavenly messengers. Her death was transformed into a bodily assumption into heaven, where she reigns as Queen of heaven and earth. Each of these additions served a specific function in the appropriation campaign. They provided Mary with the supernatural credentials that pagan converts expected from a genuine goddess figure. They created a complete mythological biography that could compete with established goddess cults. And they offered theological justification for the devotional practices that former pagans were accustomed to directing toward divine feminine figures. But the most crucial element of this transformation was the establishment of Mary's intercessory role. In pagan goddess cults, worshippers didn't approach the ultimate divine power directly. They petitioned the mother goddess to carry their requests to the cosmic realm. Isis interceded with Ra. Cybele mediated with the cosmic order. Diana advocated for her devotees before the divine assembly. Christian theology officially maintained that Jesus was the sole mediator between humanity and God. But practical Christian devotion developed along entirely different lines. Catholics were taught to pray to Mary, asking her to intercede with her son on their behalf. The theological rationale was that a mother's request would be irresistible to a loving son. The psychological reality was that this system replicated exactly the devotional patterns that former pagans had practiced for centuries. The result was a religious hybrid that satisfied both Christian theological requirements and pagan spiritual expectations. Former goddess worshippers could continue their devotional practices under Christian auspices. The Church could claim theological orthodoxy while accommodating the deepest spiritual needs of their convert population. And the strategy worked beyond the Church's wildest expectations. Christianity didn't just survive in the pagan world, it thrived. Within 3 centuries, it had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Millions of former pagans had converted, bringing their emotional investment in divine motherhood directly into Christian practice. But this success required an ongoing cover-up operation that continues to this day. The Church could never acknowledge that Marian devotion was essentially baptized paganism. They had to maintain the fiction that Mary's elevated status flowed naturally from biblical revelation and theological reflection. This cover-up necessitated the systematic suppression of historical evidence that revealed the true origins of Marian doctrine. Ancient texts that documented the parallels between Isis worship and early Christianity were relegated to restricted libraries or destroyed entirely. Archaeological evidence of church construction on former goddess temple sites was downplayed or ignored. Artistic evidence showing the direct copying of pagan iconography was explained away as coincidental similarity rather than deliberate appropriation. The most telling evidence of this ongoing cover-up is the Church's response to scholarly investigations into Christian origins. When historians document the clear connections between pagan goddess cults and Marian devotion, Church authorities don't engage with the evidence directly. Instead, they dismiss such research as anti-Christian bias or attack the credentials of the investigators. This defensive posture reveals the Church's awareness that honest historical investigation threatens the foundations of their authority. If the virgin birth was borrowed from pagan mythology, and if Marian devotion was essentially rebranded goddess worship, then Christianity's claims to unique divine revelation collapse under scrutiny. The implications extend far beyond academic historical debates. If the Church was willing to appropriate foreign religious elements to ensure its institutional success, what other supposedly divine doctrines might actually be calculated adaptations? How much of Christian theology represents genuine spiritual insight, and how much represents strategic religious marketing? These questions become even more disturbing when you examine the Church's treatment of the very traditions they borrowed from. Once Christianity achieved political dominance in the Roman Empire, Church authorities didn't content themselves with appropriating pagan elements. They actively persecuted and destroyed the original traditions they had stolen from. Isis temples were demolished. Goddess cult practitioners were executed as heretics. Ancient libraries containing mythological texts were burned. The systematic destruction of pagan religious infrastructure served a dual purpose. It eliminated competition for Christian institutions, and it erased the historical evidence that would have revealed Christianity's debts to earlier traditions. This pattern of appropriation, followed by destruction, appears throughout Christian history. Indigenous traditions across Europe, Africa, and the Americas were first studied for useful elements, then systematically suppressed once those elements had been incorporated into Christian practice. Local goddesses became Christian saints. Seasonal festivals became Christian holy days. Sacred sites became church locations. The virgin birth theft was not an isolated incident. It was the template for a global religious colonization campaign that lasted centuries and affected every continent where Christianity spread. And the psychological damage inflicted by this campaign extends far beyond the destruction of alternative religious traditions. By claiming exclusive access to divine truth while secretly borrowing from suppressed sources, the Church created a form of spiritual gaslighting that continues to affect millions of believers today. Catholics who feel drawn to Marian devotion are actually responding to psychological and spiritual impulses that predate Christianity by millennia. Their attraction to the mother goddess archetype is completely natural and psychologically healthy. But they've been taught to understand these impulses as evidence of Christian spiritual insight, rather than recognition of universal human religious needs. This creates a profound disconnect between believers' actual spiritual experience and their theological understanding of that experience. They're worshipping a goddess while being told they're practicing monotheistic religion. They're engaging in ancient fertility cult rituals while believing they're participating in divine revelation. The psychological stress created by this disconnect manifests in countless ways throughout Christian culture. The guilt and confusion that many Catholics experience around Marian devotion stems from the tension between their natural goddess-worshipping impulses and their monotheistic theological training. They sense that something doesn't quite fit, but they've been given no framework for understanding their spiritual experience accurately. Similarly, the Protestant rejection of Marian devotion represents an attempt to resolve this tension by eliminating the goddess elements entirely. But this creates its own psychological problems, as it strips Christianity of the divine feminine archetype that speaks to fundamental human spiritual needs. The entire Protestant Catholic divide can be understood as a theological argument about how much pagan goddess material should be retained in Christian practice. Catholics maintained more of the appropriated elements, while Protestants attempted a more thorough purification. But neither tradition acknowledges the actual historical origins of the dispute. This institutional dishonesty has created a spiritual crisis that extends far beyond Christian denominations. When people discover the true origins of Christian doctrine, they often experience a profound sense of betrayal. They realize they've been participating in ancient pagan practices while being told they were engaging with divine revelation. They understand that their deepest spiritual experiences have been mediated through stolen and rebranded mythological material. Some respond to this discovery by abandoning Christianity entirely, seeking more honest spiritual frameworks that acknowledge their historical sources. Others attempt to practice Christianity while consciously recognizing its pagan elements. Still others deny the historical evidence entirely, retreating into fundamentalist positions that reject scholarly investigation as satanic deception. None of these responses adequately address the fundamental problem that one of the world's largest religious institutions built its foundation on systematic appropriation while claiming divine authority for its borrowed doctrines. The virgin birth theft represents more than historical curiosity or theological debate. It reveals a pattern of institutional deception that continues to shape global spiritual life. Millions of people base their understanding of ultimate reality on narratives that were consciously borrowed from suppressed traditions. They direct their prayers to figures whose mythological biographies were systematically plagiarized from earlier sources. They participate in rituals whose origins lie in religious traditions their own institution destroyed. And perhaps most tragically, they're denied access to the actual historical and psychological sources of their spiritual experiences. They cannot fully understand their own religious impulses, because those impulses point toward truths their religious authorities dare not acknowledge. The cover-up of the virgin birth theft is ultimately a cover-up of human spiritual history itself. It represents the victory of institutional control over honest spiritual investigation. It demonstrates how religious authorities can manipulate historical narrative to maintain power while suppressing the very traditions that gave their institutions life and meaning. But the truth has a way of surfacing despite institutional suppression. Archaeological discoveries continue to document the connections between Christian and pagan traditions. Historical research continues to reveal the systematic nature of early Christian appropriation. Psychological investigation continues to illuminate the universal human needs that drove both ancient goddess worship and contemporary Marian devotion. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and growing stronger with each passing decade of scholarly investigation. The virgin birth was stolen from Egyptian mythology. Mary was transformed into a Christian version of Isis. The mother goddess was appropriated, rebranded, and installed at the center of Catholic spiritual life. This theft succeeded beyond the early church's wildest dreams. It enabled Christianity to become the dominant global religion by offering familiar spiritual experiences under new theological management. But it also created a fault line that runs through the foundation of Christian civilization, a fundamental dishonesty about the sources of its own spiritual power. And that fault line is beginning to crack under the weight of historical evidence. The stolen virgin birth is becoming impossible to defend, impossible to ignore, and impossible to explain away through theological sophistication or institutional authority. The question facing contemporary Christianity is whether it can survive the revelation of its own origins. Can a religious tradition built on systematic appropriation maintain its authority once that appropriation is fully documented and widely understood? Can believers continue their devotional practices once they recognize those practices as rebranded paganism? The answer may depend on whether religious institutions choose honest acknowledgement or continued cover-up. Because the truth about the virgin birth theft is no longer hidden in restricted libraries or archaeological reports. It's available to anyone willing to examine the evidence with intellectual honesty and emotional courage. And once you see the connections, once you recognize Isis in every Madonna and child painting, once you understand Mary as a Christianized mother goddess, once you grasp the virgin birth as mythological appropriation rather than divine revelation, you cannot unsee them. The stolen foundation of Christianity stands exposed. The only question remaining is what believers will choose to build on the ruins of institutional deception. The cover-up extends deeper than most believers ever imagine. Because once the church successfully appropriated the mother goddess archetype, they faced a new problem: how to maintain the illusion of theological purity while managing a fundamentally syncretic religious system. The solution was brilliantly devious. They created layers of theological complexity that obscured the pagan foundations while satisfying the spiritual needs of former goddess worshippers. The doctrine of the Trinity, for instance, wasn't just an abstract theological concept. It was a structural necessity that allowed the church to accommodate multiple divine figures while maintaining monotheistic credibility. Think about the psychological function of the Trinity in Catholic devotion. The Father represents the distant transcendent deity, essentially the role played by supreme gods like Zeus or Jupiter in pagan pantheons. The Son represents the accessible, suffering God-man who dies and resurrects, the role previously filled by mystery religion, saviors like Osiris, Dionysus, or Mithras. And the Holy Spirit provides the mystical, transformative, divine presence that connects believers to cosmic power. But none of these roles address the fundamental human need for divine maternal protection and intercession. The Trinity was masculine, distant, abstract. It offered no emotional equivalent to the intimate, nurturing relationship that millions of former pagans had experienced with goddess figures like Isis, Cybele, or Diana. The Church's theological architects understood this gap perfectly. They couldn't officially add a fourth person to the Trinity without destroying monotheistic orthodoxy. But they could elevate Mary to a status that functionally made her the fourth member of the divine family, while maintaining plausible theological deniability. The elevation process was gradual but systematic. First came the title, Mother of God, which placed Mary in direct relationship with the Trinity itself. If Jesus was fully divine, and Mary was his mother, then Mary held a cosmic position that transcended ordinary human status. She wasn't just another saint or holy figure. She was the woman who had literally given birth to God incarnate. Then came the doctrine of perpetual virginity, which transformed Mary from an ordinary Jewish woman who happened to bear the Messiah into a figure of supernatural purity. This wasn't just about sexual morality. It was about creating a Christian equivalent to the virgin goddesses who had dominated pagan religious imagination for centuries. The Immaculate Conception doctrine pushed this elevation even further. Mary wasn't just pure after Jesus' birth. She had been conceived without original sin, making her fundamentally different from ordinary humanity from the moment of her own conception. This gave her a metaphysical status that approached divinity itself. And finally, the Assumption doctrine completed the transformation. Mary didn't just die like other humans. She was bodily assumed into heaven, where she reigns as queen of heaven and earth. This placed her in a position of cosmic authority that rivaled or exceeded any pagan goddess. Each of these doctrinal developments served the same function. They provided theological justification for treating Mary as a goddess while maintaining the fiction of monotheistic orthodoxy. Catholics could pray to Mary, build shrines to Mary, celebrate feast days honoring Mary, and direct their primary spiritual devotion to Mary while officially worshipping only the Trinity. The psychological result was a religious system that satisfied both theological requirements and emotional needs. Former pagans could continue their goddess worship under Christian auspices. Church authorities could claim doctrinal purity while accommodating the deepest spiritual impulses of their convert population. But this theological balancing act required constant management and periodic adjustment. As Christianity spread into new territories with different pagan traditions, the Church had to adapt Mary's attributes to accommodate local goddess expectations. In areas where Celtic goddesses had been associated with healing springs, Mary appeared at holy water sites. Where Germanic goddesses had been connected to agricultural fertility, Mary became the patron of harvest festivals. Where Mediterranean goddesses had protected sailors, Mary became the star of the sea. This wasn't coincidental cultural evolution. It was strategic religious colonization. Church authorities systematically identified the primary goddess figures in each region, studied their attributes and devotional practices, and then grafted those elements onto Mary's growing mythological biography. The process is clearly documented in the historical record of church councils and papal decrees. Church authorities didn't discover Mary's various roles through mystical revelation. They assigned those roles through administrative decision-making based on their assessment of local spiritual needs and conversion opportunities. Consider the geographical distribution of major Marian apparition sites: Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe, Knock. These locations weren't random choices by a supernatural Mary appearing to peasant children. They were sites where local pagan goddess worship had been particularly strong, where the psychological and spiritual infrastructure for divine feminine devotion was already established. The apparition narratives themselves follow predictable patterns that mirror ancient goddess appearance stories. A young, pure individual receives a vision of the divine feminine figure. The goddess provides messages about healing, protection, and spiritual guidance. Miracles occur at the apparition site. Pilgrimage traditions develop around the sacred location. These patterns weren't unique to Christian Marian apparitions. They were standard elements of pagan goddess cult foundation stories. The Church wasn't documenting supernatural events. They were reproducing mythological templates that had proven successful for centuries. The proof lies in the timing and geographical distribution of these apparitions. They consistently appeared in regions where the Church was struggling to maintain Catholic identity against Protestant challenges or secular influences. Lourdes emerged during a period of French anti-clerical politics. Fatima appeared during Portuguese Republican movements. Guadalupe coincided with Spanish colonial expansion into indigenous territories. Each apparition served specific institutional needs while tapping into local goddess worship traditions. They weren't divine interventions. They were calculated theological responses to political and cultural challenges. But perhaps the most revealing evidence of the Church's ongoing appropriation strategy lies in their treatment of contemporary goddess spirituality movements. As feminism has sparked renewed interest in pre-Christian goddess traditions, the Church hasn't opposed this development directly. Instead, they've attempted to co-opt it by emphasizing Mary's feminine divine attributes and promoting her as the ultimate goddess figure. Pope John Paul II, for instance, explicitly encouraged increased Marian devotion as a response to contemporary spiritual searching. His encyclicals on Mary weren't just theological documents. They were marketing materials designed to attract people drawn to goddess spirituality back into Catholic practice. The strategy reveals the Church's continued awareness of Mary's true function within Christian theology. She isn't just Jesus' mother or a model of faith. She's the institutional solution to humanity's persistent need for divine feminine presence. She's the goddess the Church created to replace all other goddesses. And this replacement function explains why the Church has been so resistant to women's ordination and feminist theological developments. Allowing women to serve as priests or bishops would undermine Mary's unique status as the sole feminine figure with access to divine authority. It would reveal that the Church's elevation of Mary was strategic rather than theological, a calculated response to pagan spiritual needs rather than genuine recognition of feminine divine attributes. The institutional investment in maintaining Mary's goddess status while denying her goddess identity has created profound theological contradictions that continue to destabilize Catholic doctrine. Catholics pray to Mary more than to Jesus, but they're taught that she's not divine. They direct their primary spiritual devotion to a female figure, but they're told they practice monotheistic religion. They participate in goddess worship while believing they're following patriarchal theology. These contradictions create psychological stress for believers and theological confusion for Church authorities. They represent the ongoing cost of the virgin birth theft, the price of building a religious system on appropriated foundations while denying the sources of its spiritual power. The theft of the virgin birth narrative from Egyptian mythology wasn't just ancient history. It established a pattern of deception that continues to shape contemporary religious experience. Millions of Catholics participate in rebranded goddess worship while being told they're practicing biblical Christianity. They experience the spiritual power of divine feminine devotion while being denied accurate understanding of their own religious impulses. The institutional dishonesty extends beyond historical misrepresentation to psychological manipulation. The Church has created a spiritual system that satisfies ancient human religious needs while obscuring the sources of that satisfaction. Believers experience genuine spiritual connection through Marian devotion, but they're given false explanations for their experiences. This manipulation serves institutional interest by maintaining clerical authority over spiritual interpretation. If Catholics understood that their devotion to Mary connects them to pre-Christian goddess traditions, they might seek direct access to those traditions rather than accepting Church mediation. They might recognize their spiritual experiences as natural human responses to universal religious archetypes rather than evidence of Christian supernatural revelation. The Church's investment in maintaining the virgin birth deception reveals their awareness of this threat. They cannot acknowledge Mary's goddess status without undermining their claims to exclusive religious authority. They cannot admit the pagan origins of Christian doctrine without revealing the calculated nature of their theological development. So they maintain the cover-up through a combination of institutional silence, scholarly intimidation, and believer misdirection. They discourage investigation into Christian origins while promoting devotional practices that depend on those concealed origins. They celebrate Mary's divine attributes while denying her divine identity. But this strategy is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as historical evidence accumulates and scholarly investigation advances. The connections between Isis worship and Marian devotion are too clear to ignore. The archaeological evidence of church construction on goddess temple sites is too extensive to dismiss. The iconographic similarities between pagan and Christian imagery are too obvious to explain away. The virgin birth theft stands exposed as the foundational deception that enabled Christianity's global dominance. The mother goddess lives on in Catholic practice, but she wears a Christian mask that conceals her true identity from her own worshippers. And that concealment represents more than historical curiosity or theological debate. It reveals the ongoing power of institutional manipulation to shape human spiritual experience. It demonstrates how religious authorities can control the interpretation of universal spiritual impulses by controlling access to accurate historical information. The implications extend far beyond Christianity to every religious tradition that claims exclusive access to divine truth while borrowing from suppressed sources. The virgin birth theft provides a template for understanding how spiritual colonization operates, how dominant institutions appropriate, rebrand, and control the religious expressions of conquered peoples. But it also provides a template for resistance, because once the theft is recognized, once the connections are traced, once the cover-up is exposed, believers gain access to spiritual resources that extend far beyond institutional boundaries. They can recognize their devotion to Mary as participation in an ancient, universal human relationship with divine feminine power. They can understand their spiritual experiences as natural responses to archetypal religious patterns rather than evidence of supernatural intervention. They can reclaim their connection to pre-Christian goddess traditions that their own religious institution destroyed and appropriated. The stolen virgin birth becomes a doorway to spiritual liberation rather than institutional control. The goddess emerges from beneath her Christian disguise, revealing the true sources of spiritual power that have sustained human religious experience across millennia. And in that emergence, the entire edifice of Christian exclusive truth claims begins to crumble. Because if the virgin birth was stolen, if Mary is a rebranded Isis, if the mother goddess was appropriated rather than revealed, then Christianity's foundations rest not on divine intervention, but on human creativity, not on supernatural revelation, but on natural religious evolution. The Church built its empire on stolen spiritual architecture. The question facing contemporary believers is whether they will continue to worship in buildings constructed on concealed foundations, or whether they will seek access to the original spiritual sources that gave those buildings their power. The choice represents more than religious preference. It represents the difference between spiritual freedom and institutional captivity. Because as long as the virgin birth theft remains concealed, believers remain trapped in a system that exploits their deepest spiritual impulses while denying them accurate understanding of their own religious experiences. But once the theft is exposed, once the connections are traced, once the goddess is recognized beneath her Christian disguise, spiritual liberation becomes possible. The stolen virgin birth transforms from institutional weapon into spiritual doorway, a passage back to the authentic religious sources that Christianity appropriated but could never fully control. The ancient goddess calls to her children through Christian imagery, waiting for them to recognize her true identity beneath the theological masks their oppressors placed upon her face. The virgin birth theft represents both the greatest religious deception in human history and the key to its own undoing. Because truth has a way of surfacing despite institutional suppression. And the truth about the virgin birth, about Mary's goddess identity, about Christianity's pagan foundations, about the ongoing spiritual colonization of human religious experience, is breaking through the theological concrete that has concealed it for 2 millennia. The goddess rises, the theft stands exposed, and the choice between spiritual freedom and institutional deception awaits every believer willing to examine the evidence with courage, honesty, and open eyes. The theological architects understood they needed more than doctrinal sophistication to cement their appropriation. They required what can only be described as cultural programming on a massive scale, because stealing the virgin birth narrative was just the beginning. The real genius lay in how they embedded this theft so deeply into human consciousness that questioning it would feel like questioning reality itself. Consider how methodically they constructed the psychological infrastructure that would make the stolen narrative feel inevitable. They didn't just borrow Isis imagery, they created an entire sensory ecosystem that would trigger the same emotional responses that goddess worship had cultivated for millennia. The smell of incense in Christian churches wasn't accidental. It replicated the aromatic rituals that had surrounded Isis temples, the soft lighting, the hushed reverence, the architectural grandeur designed to inspire awe. Every element was calculated to reproduce the psychological states that had made goddess worship so irresistible to ancient peoples. But the most sophisticated aspect of their programming involved the manipulation of maternal instinct itself. The church understood that the bond between mother and child represents the most powerful emotional force in human experience. Every person who ever lived formed their first understanding of love, protection, and security through relationship with a maternal figure. By placing a divine mother at the center of their stolen narrative, they tapped into psychological patterns that bypass rational thought entirely. Watch a Catholic mother teaching her young child to pray to Mary. She's not engaging in theological instruction. She's activating primal emotional circuitry that connects maternal protection with cosmic safety. The child learns that when the world feels dangerous, when darkness seems overwhelming, when human protection fails, there exists a divine mother who will never abandon them. This isn't religious education, it's psychological imprinting using stolen spiritual technology that had been perfected over thousands of years of goddess worship. The brilliance of this strategy becomes apparent when you examine how it functions across different life stages. Children connect with Mary as the protective mother who watches over them. Adolescents find in her a figure of purity who understands their struggles with sexuality and identity. Adults approach her as an intercessor who can influence divine judgment on their behalf. Elderly believers see her as the cosmic mother who will guide them through death into eternal life. Each of these relationships replicates exactly the psychological functions that various goddess figures had served in pagan traditions. Isis protected children, Artemis guided adolescents, Demeter blessed adults, and Hecate shepherded souls through death. The church didn't invent these spiritual functions. They consolidated them into a single figure who could serve all the roles that multiple goddesses had previously fulfilled. This consolidation strategy reveals the calculated efficiency of the appropriation campaign. Rather than competing with dozens of different goddess cults individually, the church created a super-goddess who could absorb the devotional energy previously directed toward multiple divine feminine figures. Mary became Isis, and Cybele and Diana and Demeter all rolled into one cosmic maternal presence. The psychological impact of this consolidation cannot be overstated. Former pagans didn't have to abandon their goddess worship. They simply redirected it toward a figure who fulfilled all their previous spiritual needs while carrying Christian theological credentials. The transition felt natural, comfortable, inevitable, exactly what skilled religious marketers would design. But the church's psychological manipulation extended beyond emotional programming to include sophisticated techniques for suppressing critical thinking about their appropriation. They understood that intelligent converts would inevitably notice the similarities between Mary and the goddesses they had previously worshipped. The institutional response was to develop explanatory frameworks that acknowledged these similarities while reversing the causal relationship. The divine preparation theory became the standard apologetic response. Church authorities argued that God had planted seeds of Christian truth in pagan religions to prepare humanity for Christ's revelation. The similarities between Mary and Isis weren't evidence of borrowing. They were proof that God had been foreshadowing Christian truth through earlier, imperfect revelations. This explanation was psychologically brilliant because it transformed potential evidence of theft into confirmation of divine plan. Former pagans could acknowledge the similarities they observed while interpreting them as validation of their conversion rather than reason for suspicion. Their previous goddess worship wasn't misguided paganism, it was divinely inspired preparation for Christian truth. The Church reinforced this interpretation through systematic rewriting of historical narrative. Ancient texts that documented the chronological precedence of goddess worship were either suppressed, edited, or reinterpreted to support Christian priority. Archaeological evidence of pagan religious practices was either ignored or explained as demonic counterfeits of Christian truth. This historical revisionism created what psychologists now recognize as gaslighting on a civilizational scale. Converts were taught to distrust their own memories and observations about pagan religious traditions. They were encouraged to reinterpret their previous spiritual experiences through Christian theological frameworks that minimize pagan contributions and maximize Christian originality. The long-term psychological effects of this gaslighting continue to shape religious consciousness today. Catholics who feel drawn to Mary often experience guilt or confusion about the intensity of their devotion. They sense that their relationship with her transcends the theological boundaries their tradition officially maintains, but they lack conceptual frameworks for understanding their experience accurately. This creates what therapists recognize as cognitive dissonance, the psychological stress that results from holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Catholics love Mary as a goddess while believing they worship only God. They pray to her for divine intervention while maintaining that she's merely human. They experience her as cosmically powerful while accepting theological limitations on her authority. The Church has managed this cognitive dissonance by creating layers of theological complexity that obscure rather than resolve the underlying contradictions. Sophisticated doctrinal distinctions between worship and veneration, between intercession and mediation, between honor and adoration, provide intellectual cover for practices that function exactly like goddess worship regardless of their official theological classifications. But these theological distinctions begin to collapse when examined honestly. Catholics don't venerate Mary differently than pagans worshipped Isis. They don't pray to her for intercession differently than ancient peoples petitioned Cybele for divine assistance. They don't honor her differently than Mediterranean cultures celebrated Diana. The similarities aren't superficial or coincidental. They're structural and functional. The Church created a goddess and called her something else. They established goddess worship and labeled it Christian devotion. They built their most successful religious practices on stolen pagan foundations while maintaining elaborate theological fictions about their originality. The scope of this deception becomes even more apparent when you examine how it shaped the development of Christian art, architecture, and ritual practice. Every major element of Catholic ceremonial life can be traced to pre-Christian goddess worship traditions that the Church appropriated and rebranded. The use of candles in religious ceremonies wasn't a Christian innovation. It replicated the fire rituals that had surrounded goddess worship for centuries. The practice of pilgrimage to holy sites wasn't inspired by Christian devotion. It followed roots and patterns established by ancient goddess cult practitioners. The tradition of leaving votive offerings at sacred locations wasn't born from Christian piety. It continued practices that had connected believers to divine feminine power since prehistoric times. Even the calendar of Christian feast days reveals the systematic nature of the appropriation. Major Marian celebrations consistently coincide with ancient goddess festivals that had marked seasonal transitions for millennia. The Feast of the Assumption falls near the time when ancient peoples celebrated the harvest goddess. The Feast of the Immaculate Conception aligns with winter solstice celebrations of the mother goddess giving birth to the returning sun. This calendrical correlation wasn't accidental. Church authorities deliberately scheduled Christian celebrations to coincide with established pagan festivals, ensuring that converted populations could continue their seasonal religious observances while redirecting them toward Christian figures. The psychological comfort of familiar timing helped mask the theological transformation that was occurring. The architectural evidence provides even more compelling proof of systematic appropriation. Major Marian shrines across Europe consistently occupy sites that had been sacred to goddess worship for centuries before Christianity arrived. The famous shrine at Chartres in France sits atop a site that had been sacred to the Celtic goddess Brigid. The shrine at Guadalupe in Mexico was built on ground previously sacred to the Aztec goddess Tonantzin. This pattern appears with such consistency that it cannot be coincidental. Church authorities didn't randomly select sites for major Marian shrines. They deliberately chose locations where the psychological and spiritual infrastructure for goddess worship was already established. They understood that sacred geography carries emotional resonance that transcends particular religious traditions. The genius of this strategy becomes apparent when you consider its psychological impact on converts. Former pagans could continue visiting the same holy sites, following the same pilgrimage routes, and engaging in similar ritual practices. The landscape of their spiritual lives remained familiar, even as the theological interpretation of their experiences underwent radical transformation. But perhaps the most audacious aspect of the Church's appropriation strategy involved the systematic theft of goddess mythology itself. They didn't just borrow isolated elements from pagan traditions. They created comprehensive biographical narratives for Mary that replicated the mythological functions that various goddesses had served in ancient cultures. The story of Mary's Immaculate Conception mirrors the virgin birth narratives that surrounded numerous pagan goddesses. The account of her assumption into heaven replicates the apotheosis myths that described how mortal women became divine through supernatural intervention. The tradition of her perpetual virginity echoes the purity attributes that had defined virgin goddesses across multiple cultures. Each of these narrative elements served specific psychological functions in pagan traditions, and the Church preserved those functions while changing the theological context. Mary's Immaculate Conception provided the supernatural credentials that converts expected from genuine divine figures. Her Assumption offered hope for transcendence beyond ordinary human limitations. Her perpetual virginity maintained the purity symbolism that had made goddess figures psychologically powerful across cultures. The result was a composite mythological figure who could satisfy the spiritual needs that had previously required multiple goddess relationships. Mary became the virgin and the mother, the intercessor and the protector, the cosmic queen and the humble servant. She embodied contradictions that would be impossible for any historical human figure, but were perfectly natural for a mythological construction based on multiple pagan prototypes. This mythological hybridization reveals the calculated nature of the Church's appropriation strategy. They weren't randomly borrowing attractive elements from pagan traditions. They were systematically constructing a religious figure who could absorb and redirect the devotional energy that had sustained goddess worship for millennia. The success of this construction can be measured by its durability. 2,000 years after the theft was accomplished, Mary continues to function as the primary focus of Catholic devotional life for millions of believers. She receives more prayers than Jesus, inspires more pilgrimage than the Trinity, and generates more emotional investment than any officially recognized member of the Christian pantheon. This devotional reality reveals the true scope of what the Church accomplished when they stole the virgin birth narrative from Egyptian mythology. They didn't just borrow a story, they hijacked the entire psychological and spiritual infrastructure that had sustained human religious experience since prehistoric times. The mother goddess archetype represents more than cultural artifact or historical curiosity. It embodies the recognition that divine power manifests through feminine as well as masculine principles, that cosmic creativity emerges from receptive as well as assertive energy, that spiritual authority can be nurturing as well as commanding. By appropriating this archetype while denying its true nature, the Church created a profound spiritual schizophrenia that continues to afflict Western religious consciousness. believers experience the power of divine feminine presence through Marian devotion, but they're taught to understand that experience through patriarchal, theological frameworks that minimize feminine spiritual authority. This creates psychological splitting that manifests in countless ways throughout Christian culture. The elevation of celibacy over marriage reflects the fear of feminine power that patriarchal theology cannot acknowledge directly. The exclusion of women from positions of religious authority reveals the institutional recognition that feminine spiritual power threatens male clerical control. The ongoing debates about reproductive rights demonstrate the continuing attempt to control feminine creative power that the Church appropriated but never fully understood. All of these contemporary religious and cultural conflicts can be traced back to the original theft of the virgin birth narrative. Because when you steal someone's spiritual identity, when you appropriate their religious power while denying its source, you create wounds that persist across centuries and affect every aspect of human consciousness. The Church built its empire on stolen goddess energy, but that energy continues to assert itself despite institutional attempts to contain and control it. Women continue to seek direct spiritual authority despite theological prohibitions. Believers continue to pray primarily to Mary, despite official emphasis on Trinity worship. Pilgrims continue to visit sacred sites that predate Christianity, despite efforts to present them as purely Christian locations. The goddess refuses to remain buried beneath Christian theological concrete. She emerges in Marian apparitions that follow ancient goddess appearance patterns. She surfaces in popular devotions that replicate pagan ritual practices. She asserts herself through contemporary goddess spirituality movements that explicitly reclaim pre-Christian religious traditions. Each of these emergences represents a crack in the institutional structure that was built on stolen foundations. Each revelation of pagan origins creates an opportunity for believers to recognize the true sources of their spiritual experiences. Each connection between Mary and Isis opens a doorway to religious understanding that transcends the limitations of any single institutional tradition. The stolen virgin birth becomes a bridge rather than a barrier, a connection point that links contemporary spiritual seekers to the ancient goddess wisdom that their own religious tradition appropriated and concealed. Through recognizing Mary's true identity as a Christianized Isis, believers can reclaim access to spiritual resources that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single religious institution. This reclamation process represents more than historical correction or theological adjustment. It involves the restoration of spiritual wholeness that was fractured when the Church separated believers from accurate understanding of their own religious impulses. It requires the integration of masculine and feminine divine principles that patriarchal theology artificially divided. It demands the acknowledgement of religious truth that transcends the exclusive claims of any particular institutional tradition. The virgin birth theft stands as both the greatest religious deception in human history and the key to its own resolution, because the very success of the appropriation preserved the goddess energy that it was designed to control. Mary's continued power within Christian devotion proves the enduring vitality of the spiritual principles that the Church stole from Egyptian mythology. And as that truth becomes increasingly apparent, as the connections become undeniable, as the evidence mounts beyond institutional ability to suppress or explain away, believers face a choice that will determine the future of human spiritual evolution. They can continue participating in stolen religious practices while accepting false explanations for their experiences. They can maintain their devotion to a goddess who wears a Christian mask while denying her true identity. They can preserve institutional loyalty while sacrificing spiritual authenticity. Or they can embrace the truth that the goddess has been calling to them through Christian imagery all along. They can recognize Mary as the face that Isis wears in a Christian world. They can acknowledge their participation in ancient, universal human relationship with divine feminine power that no institution can own or control. The choice represents more than personal religious preference. It determines whether human spiritual evolution will continue to be constrained by institutional deception or liberated by recognition of its authentic sources. Because the goddess never belonged to Christianity, she was borrowed, not born, appropriated, not revealed, stolen, not given. And she is ready to come home to those who have the courage to see through the theological masks their oppressors placed upon her eternal face. The virgin birth theft ends not with institutional victory, but with spiritual homecoming. The goddess rises from beneath Christian disguise to reclaim her children and restore the spiritual wholeness that was fractured when religious truth was first divorced from its authentic sources. The ancient mother calls. The stolen narrative crumbles, and the choice between spiritual freedom and institutional captivity awaits every soul willing to answer her eternal invitation to come home. Home. But the theft runs even deeper than institutional strategy or theological adaptation. Because when you examine the mechanics of how this appropriation actually functioned on the ground, in the daily lives of converts, in the rhythms of worship, in the intimate moments when believers reach toward the divine, you discover something that reveals the true audacity of what the church accomplished. They didn't just steal stories, they stole souls. Walk through any major city in the Roman Empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and you'd witness the psychological colonization process in real time. Picture Alexandria, that cosmopolitan crossroads where Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Jewish cultures collided in a marketplace of ideas and identities. Here, massive temples to Isis dominated the skyline, their courtyards filled with pilgrims who had traveled from across the Mediterranean to experience the goddess's healing presence. These weren't casual believers dabbling in exotic spirituality. These were people whose entire emotional and psychological infrastructure was built around their relationship with Isis. They had been raised on stories of her protective love. They had experienced her interventions in moments of crisis. They had organized their understanding of cosmic order around her role as the Divine Mother, who interceded between humanity and the harsh realities of existence. Their daily prayers were addressed to her. Their seasonal celebrations revolved around her mythological cycle. Their understanding of death and afterlife depended on her promise to guide souls through the underworld. Their sense of feminine dignity and power was anchored in her example of divine authority wielded through maternal love rather than masculine force. Now imagine Christian missionaries arriving in this environment with their original message. A Jewish carpenter's son had been executed by Roman authorities, but his death somehow provided salvation for all humanity. No miraculous birth, no divine mother, no cosmic queen, just a crucified criminal whose followers claimed he had risen from the dead. The psychological disconnect would have been insurmountable. How do you ask someone to abandon their relationship with a goddess who had sustained their family for generations, in favor of worshipping a figure whose story contained none of the mythological elements they had been conditioned to recognize as indicators of genuine divinity? The early evangelists tried this approach initially, and the results were predictably disastrous. Paul's preaching in Athens, as recorded in Acts, provides a perfect example. When he attempted to present Christian doctrine to sophisticated pagans without mythological adaptation, they dismissed him as a babbler promoting strange deities. His message simply didn't register within their spiritual framework. But then something changed. Later Christian missionaries began arriving with a different story. Suddenly, Jesus had a divine birth narrative that followed familiar mythological patterns. Suddenly, he had a divine mother whose attributes and iconography resonated with established goddess worship. Suddenly, Christianity offered spiritual elements that former pagans could recognize and embrace. The conversion rate exploded, but here's what makes this transformation so psychologically insidious. The missionaries didn't present this as adaptation or borrowing. They presented it as revelation. They claimed that the similarities between Christian doctrine and pagan mythology were evidence that God had been preparing humanity for Christian truth through earlier, incomplete religious experiences. This explanation allowed converts to maintain their emotional investment in familiar mythological patterns while redirecting that investment toward Christian figures. They didn't have to abandon their love for the Divine Mother. They simply transferred it to Mary. They didn't have to reject their belief in miraculous birth narratives. They accepted that Jesus' birth fulfilled and perfected what earlier stories had only approximated. The psychological brilliance of this strategy cannot be overstated. Instead of creating cognitive dissonance by demanding that converts abandon their deepest spiritual attachments, the Church allowed them to preserve those attachments while changing their object. The emotional infrastructure remained intact, while the theological interpretation underwent radical transformation. But this preservation came at a cost that the Church concealed from converts and continues to hide from contemporary believers. Because when you transfer devotional energy from its original mythological context to a theological system that denies that context, you create spiritual schizophrenia that manifests in countless destructive ways. Consider what happened to the converts who transferred their Isis devotion to Mary. In Egyptian mythology, Isis was an active agent who used her own divine power to conceive Horus and protect him from cosmic enemies. She wasn't a passive vessel for divine intervention. She was a goddess wielding cosmic authority through her own will and wisdom. But Christian theology stripped Mary of this agency and authority. She became a human woman whose primary virtue was submission to divine will. Her miraculous conception of Jesus wasn't evidence of her own divine power. It was proof of her willingness to accept God's plan without question or resistance. The stolen goddess refuses to remain silent. 2,000 years of theological concrete cannot bury what was never truly dead. Every prayer whispered to Mary in cathedral shadows, every candle lit before her statue, every tear shed in desperate petition to the Divine Mother, all of it echoes with the voice of Isis calling her children home through the bars of their Christian cage. You've witnessed the architecture of the greatest theft in human history. Not gold or land or kingdoms, but something far more precious. The spiritual DNA of an entire civilization. The Church didn't just borrow a story. They hijacked the sacred relationship between humanity and the divine feminine, rebranded it, and sold it back to its rightful owners under a Christian trademark. But here's what they never anticipated. Truth has its own gravity. No matter how deeply buried, no matter how elaborately disguised, it pulls everything toward itself until the foundations crack and the whole edifice comes tumbling down. The virgin birth was stolen from Egyptian mythology. Mary is Isis wearing a theological mask. The mother goddess was appropriated, not revealed. And once you see it, once you recognize the borrowed pose in every Madonna painting, once you trace the iconographic DNA from Isis Lactans to Christian art, once you understand that your deepest spiritual impulses are echoing ancient wisdom that predates Christianity by millennia, you cannot unsee it. The choice before you isn't between faith and doubt. It's between spiritual freedom and institutional captivity, between honoring the authentic sources of divine feminine power and accepting the sanitized patriarchal substitute that was designed to keep you dependent on clerical authority. The goddess is rising, the truth is breaking through, and the only question remaining is whether you'll have the courage to come home to what was always yours.